Hi, glad to see you on your channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to us. Have a good view. Between 1944 and 1945, 15 of the 16 night fighter squadrons of the U.S. Army Air Forces had time to fight with the P-61A and P-61B. Black Widow crews were officially credited with 127 enemy airplanes shot down. Nightwingers were successful 47 more times on other types of fighters, with 32 victories on Beaufighters, 12 victories on Lightnings, 2 on P-70s, and 1 on a Mosquito. Compared to the 15,066 victories of the U.S. Army Air Forces as a whole, these numbers do not look impressive, but as a percentage, they are well within the ratio of the number of trained 485 night crews to the total number of fighter pilots, over 35,000. The post-war history of the P-61 in Europe. The Western European detachment of the 414th NFS returned to the squadron's main base in the last days of April 1945, and the unit met the end of the war in Italy in full strength. As early as June, however, it ceased flying and began preparing for transfer to another theater, and in August, it returned to the United States. The 416th, the second of the Mediterranean squadrons at the end of the war, underwent rearmament from Mosquito MX-30s to P-61Bs in the summer, mostly those previously used by the 404th Squadron, and joined the occupation forces in Austria in August, before being transferred to Germany exactly a year later. Of the 4 squadrons that ended the war in Germany, the 422nd and 425th moved back to France in July-August 1945 and returned to America in August-September, where the 422nd was immediately disbanded. The other 2, the 415th and 417th, remained in the occupation forces, but the first was disbanded in February 1946. Black Widows in China, Burma, India, and the Pacific Islands. Both squadrons of the Chinese-Burmese Indian Front 426th and 427th ended the war in China, but immediately after the end of hostilities returned to India, preparing for the upcoming demobilization, and in October-November departed for disbandment in the United States. Of the 8 squadrons of the Pacific Theater, 3 ended the war on islands belonging to the United States. The 6th Squadron, formed in Hawaii back in 1917, in the last months of the war was responsible for air defense of the same islands and continued to be on duty until its transfer in June 1946 to the occupation forces in Japan. 2 squadrons ended up in the Philippines, 419th on Luzon and 550th on Leyte. The latter departed in December for disbandment in the United States, while the former continued to fly in the Philippines until its transfer to the cadre category in August 1946. The remaining 5 squadrons were based in overseas Japan as of mid-August 1945. The 549th NFS ended the war at Iwo Jima and there fell under disbandment in early February 1946. In late June of that year, a new squadron with the same number began forming on American Guam, but it never reached operational status. A single squadron, the 418th, was also based in Okinawa. It was transferred to Japan in October 1945, but was brought back the following March, and on the island of Iwo neighboring Okinawa, 3 night fighter squadrons ended the war, the 421st, 547th, and 548th. The 547th was also transferred to Japan in October 1945, but in November it stopped flying P-61s and was disbanded the following February. The 548th was sent to America in December, where it was immediately disbanded, and the 421st joined the occupation forces in Japan in November, where it was joined by the 6th Squadron from Hawaii in June 1946. Black Widows in North America. The 414th Squadron arrived in California in August 1945 and began the long process of reforming, but it was not brought to operational readiness until August of the following year, simultaneously with the transfer to South Carolina, from where it was sent in March 1947 to cover the Panama Canal. In February 1946, simultaneously with the disbandment of the former Squadron No. 415 in Germany, a new unit with the same name was formed in the metropolitan area of Columbia, but left it cadre. In July 1946, this paper squadron was transferred to South Carolina, where it was filled with flight and maintenance personnel the following month. There it did active duty until it was transferred to Alaska in May 1947. The 425th returned to California from Europe in September 1945 and continued patrols and training flights until the crews were demobilized the following March, and in September the unit returned to operations with new personnel and a simultaneous transfer to Washington State. High-altitude Widow. The Black Widow's speed and altitude characteristics at the design stage were seen as sufficient for such an aircraft. But by the time the pre-production batch was tested, the requirements had increased significantly, and the P-61's rapid drop in speed at altitudes above 20,000 feet was perceived by the military as a serious shortcoming. On November 11, 1943, Air Force Headquarters initiated work to replace the Interceptor's propulsion system in order to increase its practical ceiling and maximum speed at high altitudes. On the engine itself, there was no disagreement. Both the Army and the manufacturer considered the optimal option R-2800 Series C, producing 2,800 HP in emergency mode. The only issue of debate was the method of increasing altitude, two-stage drive supercharger or turbocharger. In early 1941, at the paper stage of the P-61 design, this issue was already before the customers and designers of the vehicle. At that time, they opted for the blower, which was less efficient, but promised lower fuel consumption and thus longer patrols. Now, under the change conditions, the compressor lobby took the upper hand. In the first days of December, Northrop provided a preliminary outline of the project, and in the last days of the year, the Army issued papers for the delivery of General Electric CH-5 compressors to be installed on one of the serial P-61A. However, the company's engineers were then too busy with the deployment of serial production of the Widow and development work on a more interesting to George Northrop himself, Project Bomber Flying Wing XB-35. So in agreement with the military, the implementation of this contract was subcontracted to the firm Goodyear, already cooperating with Northrop in the supply of components for the assembly of the P-61. Initially, they wanted to use R-2877 engines, but their delivery was postponed for an unknown period, so eventually settled on the less scarce Marine Engines Model 14W. In early January 1944, formalized a contract for delivery from naval stocks. In mid-February, one of the P-61A-5s under construction was selected for conversion to the XP-61C, and in April they decided to convert one more unit, choosing one of the A-10s for this purpose. In the same month, the letter C was retained only for production vehicles, and the prototypes were renamed XP-61D. In May, both airplanes were transferred to Goodyear, and the first pair of engines was delivered there, the second one in July. Despite the fact that the compressors had already been used on American aircraft for many years, the work to combine one serial unit with another turned out to be long, complex, and associated with constant breakdowns during bench tests. Even replacing the engines with the R-2857 model, which successfully worked in conjunction with the CH-5 compressor on the Thunderbolts, did not help. By the end of November, when the flight tests of the prototypes began, they had time to remotorize them once again on the finally received engines model R-2877. To prevent a drop in production rates during the transition to the new variant, it was necessary to maintain continuity with previous modifications of the fighter. This precluded a complete redesign and reconfiguration of the fuselage beams, so we had to settle for minimal changes. The result was peculiar. Additional air ducts on the outside of the cowl and a large fairing at the bottom not only worsened aerodynamics, but also left a purely external impression of foreignness. Nevertheless, even with the obviously non-ideal execution of the project, the airplane confirmed the calculated characteristics and could be put into production. So starting with the 651st serial Black Widow, the company had to switch to the production of the P-61C modification. Since under previous contracts it was to deliver only 117 machines, an additional order for 400 copies was issued in early 1945. In the process of testing, the XP-61D was fitted with special high-altitude propellers, which became another visual distinction of the P-61C. They were based on a hub with a blade-turning mechanism from the standard Widow propeller of Curtiss Electric, coupled with wide paddle-shaped blades made by A.O. Smith. After their installation, they recorded a very respectable final performance of the aircraft, a top speed of 430 mph and a ceiling of 41,000 feet. However, the reliability of the propulsion system left much to be desired, so in the spring of 1945, the Army curtailed the test program, intending to resume it on production models. The production P-61C-1s differed from the prototypes in airframe, armament, and equipment identical to the B-20 variant, R-2800 7.3 engines, and the presence of braking grills extending from the upper and lower surfaces of the wings. Air braking aids were first requested by the military as early as December 1942, following an inspection of the second XP-61 prototype, hoping to introduce this detail from about the 200th production model. The firm agreed, but promised introduction at a later date, from about the 700th production model. In the end, the manufacturer was ahead of its own forecast by 50 machines because without brake grills, interception of low-speed targets on the P-61C became a problem. The development of fighter brakes, as was their official name, was carried out by the designers in conjunction with the Army Laboratory at Wright Field. In 1944, they were safely tested on the first serial P-61A1, but a year later on the serial P-61C suddenly found out that the release of grids on high-speed dive violates the streamline of the plumage. The aircraft first does not respond to the pilot took the helm, and then a sharp jump overload reaches the destructive. That time, the test pilot managed to use a parachute, so the cause of the accident was quickly determined. However, they were not able to eliminate it, so they simply imposed restrictions on the brake application modes. Other permanent disadvantages of the high-altitude Widow were the lack of reliability of the power plant and its tendency to overheat and catch fire, as well as an increase of about 2,000 pounds in weight, which impaired maneuverability, handling, and takeoff and landing performance. Fully fueled and with 4 outboard tanks, the machine finally lost the lightness and ease of piloting inherent in early model fighters. But against the backdrop of increasing combat capabilities, it was simply accepted. The first production P-61C-1 passed military acceptance on July 14, 1945, just a month before the end of hostilities, so the production flywheel did not have time to gain momentum. Only half a dozen copies were produced before the official end of the war, and after the acceptance of the 41st serial P-61C on January 28, 1946, production of the Black Widow was stopped. At that time, there were at least 13 more machines in ready or almost ready condition, but they were written off right from the factory assembly line. Thus, out of 1182 ordered P-61 fighters of all modifications, Northrop delivered 706 aircraft to customers, 2 XP-61s, 13 YP-61s, 200 P-61A, 450 P-61Bs, and 41 P-61Cs. At the end of World War II, the Air Force had 420 P-61A and P-61B Widows on its books. About 50 of them were soon cut up for metal, and the same number found their final resting place in aviation graveyards. But even those that remained in service, taking into account the post-war reduction of the Army and the forthcoming transition of the Air Force to jet technology, were more than enough for peaceful service. In such conditions, 4 dozen Super Widows were not too much in demand and were used mainly for various tests and research, and less than a third of the airplanes of this modification were in service. For some time, 12 machines were on the balance of the 325th Air Group, and single copies passed through the 449th Squadron and some other units. The last F-61C was decommissioned in April 1949, having lasted less time in service than earlier fighters. Black Widow for the Navy. The P-61 was designed and produced for the Army, but the Navy, as early as the summer of 1942, was also interested in the project. By mid-1944, the number of Widows at Army storage bases had grown sufficiently to allow them to be shared with another branch of the armed forces. However, in July, the Marines themselves refused to receive them because the F-7F Tiger Cat was on its way, and it was decided to choose it as the primary night fighter for the Navy and Marine Corps. Nevertheless, the P-61s did get into the Corps, but only as flying desks for training Tiger Cat radar operators. In September 1945, 12 unarmed training P-61Bs from the 319th Air Force Training Wing were transferred to the Navy, where they were assigned new serial numbers and the new designation FT-1, later changed to F-2T-1 when the sailors remembered the existence of the earlier P-61A. Until April 1946, these machines were actually used in combat training for Marine Corps night fighter crews, but then the Widows were reclassified as courier and auxiliary aircraft. In August 1947, the last remaining Navy Widows were decommissioned. In 1964, a Mexican F-15A was sold back to the U.S. and also converted to a firefighting airplane. It spent the next few years operating in California, remaining the last flying aircraft of the P-61 family, before being lost in an accident on September 6, 1968. Taking off to extinguish a fire, the pilot first failed to gain speed in time and then started braking too late. The machine flew out of the runway and collapsed. The fire started was extinguished by one of the airplanes that had taken off earlier, and the injured pilot was pulled out of the cockpit alive. This incident ended the flying history of the extraordinary Northrop twin-beam fighter. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to us. See you soon.